Hey guys, I'm going to try to make good on a promise. I'm going to do probably a truncated version of, I promised Paul Desmond and Cal Jader and Dave Brubeck associated people some time ago. Recorded it twice, each time going on for an hour and a half, and had problems and was unable to publish it. And didn't really want to do it a third time. So I've been putting it off and decided maybe a short version of Paul Desmond is maybe better than none. I don't know. But coming out of my Dave Brubeck profile, and my whole point of that and doing these interconnected musicians was basically how I went from one to the other myself. You know, how one musician buying one musician's albums leads to other musicians, you know, associated musicians, because they play in each other's albums, and how you get from one guy to the next. Nothing unusual if you listen to the VC, you know, if you're a VC person. Other people, that doesn't affect them so much. They go buy a Pink Floyd album, they have no idea who's in the band. But that's not the VC at all. So, Paul Desmond, born in 1924. I thought initially that he had met Dave Brubeck, which is his biggest association, I guess, in college. They knew each other in college. But actually in 1944, Desmond was apparently drafted into the Army and was a part of the Army band. And Brubeck got drafted and attempted to become part of the same Army band, auditioning for them, etc., etc. And apparently that's where they met. Now, also, after their Army stint, they were both at the same college studying music together. And that's what led to their long on and off association. The very first, I guess, organized, and most of the stuff that I'm showing, a lot of it I've shown already. But the first organized group, really, of Dave Brubeck was this octet with a whole bunch of people, including Cal Jader, who was playing drums initially, Dave Van Crite, Dick Collins, Paul Desmond, obviously, was playing with him. A whole bunch of people that, if you really follow jazz or even creative music, went on to have composing careers, arranging careers in serious music. Let me see. I'm missing. Oh, William O. Smith was another one. Dave Van Crite, Dick Collins, all arrangers and composers as well that went on to do various things inside and outside the jazz world. We're all part of this, and they all wrote for this octet, apparently. And they started in 46, and they lasted for a while, but couldn't really get any work, so the band broke up into basically a trio. But Paul Desmond was right there, you know, in the beginning with Dave in the octet, and that's really where their career started. When they weren't able to get work, some of this album was recorded in 46, by the way, and apparently they had some material recorded, not enough for a full LP. I don't think, it's not real clear. I don't think that material came out at the time, or it may have come out on, you know, a 10-inch or mini album or something. At some point in the future, a couple years down the line, though, they did get a chance to record more material, and it was enough to fill out a regular-sized LP. And that's when the LP came out, or this is the, you know, the reissue, obviously. But I don't know if that original material actually came out in 46, that first batch of stuff. But this octet, which couldn't really get work, pared down to a trio with Cal Jader. It was just a Dave Brubeck trio with Cal Jader on drums, actually. And Paul Desmond was out, as well as all the other musicians. And Dave Brubeck worked in that trio, bass, drums, and piano, with Cal Jader at that point also playing vibes on some things. Interesting trio. I've showed that album before, the trio stuff, the 2 vinyl set, and I'm sure that stuff has been reissued on CD. That's really nice, for you people that may like Dave Brubeck. You probably have his most, a lot of the material that he recorded was with that quartet with Paul Desmond, and saxophone, piano, bass, and drums. Once you get a taste of that stuff, it's interesting to hear Dave Brubeck in other contexts, which I've mentioned, and even that trio is really nice stuff. I really like it, with no horns, kind of have the piano up front, really up front. But after a few years, the trio became the very famous quartet. This is, I love this cover. This came out in the 70s, but that's such a 60s cover that I like. And fairly popular with the quartet, with Paul Desmond back in place. And the rhythm section kind of changed a lot. This is a repackaging of 2 albums, and according to the history that I looked up, these 2 albums are fairly successful. They weren't quite on the level of Time Out and Take 5, which came a few years later. But these 2 albums were kind of breakthrough, fairly popular albums. March 2, 1953, the first one was recorded, Jazz at Oberlin College. And then there was the second album in here. These were both initially released separately and are once again available separately now on CD. And there's a second one, Jazz at College of the Pacific, which was recorded December 14th, 1953. So about 9 months between these 2 live albums. And both were fairly popular. And both still available because they're, amongst the more popular things that the quartet did. The quartet, did a lot of albums. Like I said, the rhythm section was always changing pretty much with Dave Brubeck. A lot of people know Joe Morello on drums and Eugene Wright, which I think those were the 2 guys in place for the Time Out album. But they had various people on these 2 albums. They had Ron Crotty on bass, Crotty, and 2 different drummers. In March of 53, it was Lloyd Davis on drums. By December of 53, it was Joe Dodge on drums. And they were going and, they were at it. And that was what they were doing in 53. The quartet kind of caught on and got popular. Dave made the cover. Actually, the whole the popularity of the whole quartet is really how Brubeck managed to get on the cover of Time magazine. I'm not sure what year that was, and I had it up here. 50 in the 50s. 50 was before Time Out. Actually, I was surprised to find out that his Brubeck made it on the cover of Time magazine, which was a big deal back then. Magazines were still heavily read in a time when not everybody even had TV, and I want to say he made the cover of Time around 55, right around somewhere 55 to 56, somewhere in there, which was even before Time Out was a big success. And getting on the cover of Time magazine was a really big deal, Probably more people read that than had TV at that time. TVs were still quite expensive back then. While he was in Brubeck's quartet, and they were doing a lot of work, obviously they're popular, they're playing a lot of live gigs, I guess in the jazz world, you can sell so many records. But I did actually read that one of Brubeck's albums, around 55, I want to say, 1955, actually made it to number 5 in the pop charts. That's something, in the pop charts, not the jazz charts, the pop charts. And obviously that means they were selling a lot more copies than the jazz dudes were. So it was pretty damn successful. But while that whole thing was going on, and the quartet was taking off, and obviously being popular, especially back then, everybody, well, jazz musicians anyway, are geared toward live playing. You get a successful band, and people want to hear you, so you play. There's not too often in the jazz world, certainly in that time, that you hear the jazz guys taking 2 years off of the road kind of thing. They just didn't do that. But Paul was also recording solo albums. And initially, I bought this because I love the OJC. I bought this probably for that list price, $5.98, because I think this was a Sam Goody album. I bought this when this was reissued, when this was new. And it's a very interesting album. I bought it because I knew who Paul Desmond was. I dug the cover. I really like the OJC, the original jazz classics, how they went back, and I've said this before. Used the original album covers. This in particular, which I haven't checked to see if this was on CD. This is a really, really interesting album. I don't know offhand if this quartet actually worked and did live performances. Now, none of this is really avant-garde, obviously. If you know Dave Brubeck, and his associates are, fairly conservative mainstream jazz, and there's nothing wrong with that. Don't really get too far into avant-garde stuff. And this is true for Paul Desmond's side projects as well. But that doesn't mean that they are just really necessarily mining the same territory. This album, which I bought just because it looked interesting, I didn't know who Paul Desmond was. I didn't really look at it too quickly when I first picked it up. But when I heard it, it was quite interesting. This was a solo album, obviously, done in 1956. Paul Desmond put a quartet together. He didn't have a lot of work to do. He actually used the rhythm section, the bassist and drummer, of the then current Dave Brubeck quartet. And at that time, it was Norman Bates, the bassist, who unfortunately has the same name as the guy in Psycho, the main character in Psycho, and drummer Joe Dodge. So those were the guys that were, at the time, in 56, the members of the Brubeck quartet. So Paul just took those two guys and asked this guy, Don Elliott, if he wanted to round out the quartet. The interesting thing is that instead of Don Elliott being what you would expect, a piano player or a guitar player or something like that, Don Elliott plays this thing called the mellophone, which I had to look up because I wasn't sure what it was. I know what it sounds like from listening to the album, but it turns out the mellophone is a horn instrument. And it was essentially made, I believe, for marching bands to be a kind of instrument that is somewhere in between a trumpet and a French horn. And I think it was created for a practical reason, I guess because of the size of the bell or the size of the actual French horn. It's not easy to walk around with. Somebody actually created this contraption that was a smaller horn instrument bell that was apparently somehow a cross between a French horn and a trumpet. And that is what Don Elliott plays. So you have to think about that. This was very unusual for the time. You've got a quartet with no harmonic instrument. You don't have a guitar. You don't have a piano. You have bass drums and two horn players. So even though the music itself is, a fairly conservative jazz, it's really interesting. It's a nice mellow, it's mellow, but it's got two horns, and with the two horns, bass and drums, I wouldn't say it almost sounds like classical music, but you have that element of having two horns. They're obviously not blowing free jazz kind of stuff. So they're playing melodies and solos and improvising. And it's actually really pretty and really nice. There's 8 tracks on the album, 2 are Desmond originals, Dizzy Gillespie track, 1 track by Don Elliott, an original, obviously, and a Jerry Mulligan track. So, I have to look this up to see if this is available on CD. I should have done it. I really recommend this. Paul Desmond did a lot of good solo albums. And he varied his sound a bit from album to album. maybe a bit like Jim Hall did. If you're familiar with Jim Hall's solo works, Jim didn't like to really repeat himself by using, so he always surrounded himself with a different permeation of instruments and musicians, from solo to quartets to trios, etc. And Paul, I think, had a little bit of that in him. But I haven't looked to see if this is on CD, and it's not obviously a big seller, but it's a really sweet, mellow album. If you really appreciate the quieter, more conservative, not avant-garde jazz, it's just really nice to have the with the two horns, and of course Desmond's alto saxophone. If you've heard it, you know what it sounds like. It's soft, it's mellow, it's a bit like Stan Getz, maybe, like certainly along that, quite a famous soft velvety tone. It's very nice. This one I bought on a bit of a lark. Skylark is the name of it. This is jumping way ahead to the days when Paul Desmond. I believe Paul Desmond left the actual Dave Brubeck quartet around 1967 or so. They had quite a few reunions, Brubeck and Desmond, including one in 1977, which was shortly before Desmond passed away. So they did get together for tours, again over the years, but not as a full-time regular band after, I guess, 1967, I believe, was the split. And of course Dave continued on. So Paul was doing a solo thing. And this is an album he recorded for CTI. And, Paul is not the kind of guy you would associate with CTI. CTI was kind of like a funky, modern, more electric jazz thing. And I forget who else it was. I saw there was a Paul Desmond album that was recorded for a label that was a very short-lived label that was more on the avant-garde side and didn't even have, they had maybe a dozen releases. And oddly enough, Desmond was probably the best-known guy that recorded for this label. I'd have to look up to see who it was. So Desmond was all over the place in terms of labels he recorded for and popping up in places you might not expect them. This Skylark, which I think I did look up months ago when I tried to first record this, this is a really sweet. This, is along the lines of a more typical CTI thing. There's no liner information in here, which really sucks. They don't tell you who plays what on what track. No recording date. I'm betting if this was reissued on CD, hopefully there would be a recording date on there. But the release date was 1974, so it was either recorded in 1974 or 1973. There's only a list on the cover saying who the musicians are that play on the album, but not who plays on each track, so it's a little more than a little confusing. You have Ralph McDonald on percussion, Bob James playing acoustic and electric pianos. I seem to prefer the things that Bob James did as an accompanist to his solo stuff. And he does appear on, this is the mid-70s. His career was pretty much taken off by then. But even earlier than this, Bob James does appear in a bunch of interesting jazz albums. Not at all like the kind of soft jazz that he became associated with. Jack DeJohnette on drums, Ron Carter on bass, because I think Ron Carter has to play on every CTI release that ever came out. Gene Bertoncini on guitar, mostly a studio guitarist, I think, because I've only ever seen his name in association with albums like this that were basically studio creations, and not live bands. I mean, not that Gene Bertoncini didn't play live, but I believe he was more of a studio musician. And also on guitar, Gabor Szabo, which is interesting. So you got two guitarists, so you really have to listen to see. A lot of times, Gabor plays acoustic guitar. I haven't spun this actually lately, and I am dying to hear it again. I don't know if you're going to be able to tell what guitarist is playing one track, whether they're both playing on. I doubt that they're both playing on all tracks, and there's no information on here, which is kind of disheartening. So I don't know if anybody has the CD version of this by any chance. I think this is fairly popular from about '74. I remember liking this album very much when I bought it. Again, it's a little more modern. It's a little more electric. Gene Bertoncini certainly is playing electric. I don't know if Gabor Szabo played electric. I don't think so. And you've got Bob James, who does play acoustic, but he also plays electric piano on here. Another one I'd recommend. This is more if you're more into the slightly more electric, modern stuff. But that first album of his I showed, I got to really recommend this one too, just for the unusual concept of the instruments. No guitars, no keyboards. Very, very interesting. There's a couple things that are, there's also an album that I don't have called Pure Desmond that was apparently very popular as well. My introduction to Paul, though, I think this was the first album I ever got by him, which was odd, because it was one of his last solo albums. This was recorded on several nights, live album, between October 25th and November 1st, 1975, so about 2 years before he passed away. And the reason that I bought this, the Paul Desmond Quartet, I can remember the store that doesn't exist anymore that I bought this at. It was a department store called Corvettes, which was probably only in this part of the country. And it was a department store. They sold toasters and clothes. And, at that time, a lot of those stores had a record section. Most of those stores' record sections were the top 50 or whatever, But this store had an absolute enormous record selection. And they had entire walls covered from floor to ceiling with these things tagged onto the walls that you could put the albums in, So they actually had these album holders that hold about 10 deep albums on the wall, and above that, and it went all the way up the wall. You had maybe, 7 or 8 side by side, and going all up the wall, all the way against one of the walls on the store. It went on and on. In addition to that, the regular record racks like you flip through. So as a result of having allotted so much space to the record section, they must have been making a lot of money on them. The best prices anywhere. They also had imports. So, the stuff that they had jazz section, rock section, classical section. They probably even had folk section. I'm sure they even had easy listening back then. This is the 70s. And that's where I bought this. And two reasons I bought it. Being my first Paul Desmond, coming out of the rock thing, I liked live albums. They were a bit more, exciting, or I liked the live sound a little bit more. Live sound was a little bit thicker maybe at that time. I love the idea of a club date for jazz in general, which is obviously what this was. This was a club date in Canada, Bourbon Street, Toronto, Canada. And it was a double record, which I like. When I first got something by somebody and I didn't have a lot of material by them, I liked having more than one album's worth of material to kind of sink your teeth into. And this is about 71 minutes, I think, for the two records in here. And the thing, so being a 2-record set where I got a little more of my money's worth, being a live thing, which I dug. 2 other things really sold me on it versus another Paul Desmond album. And that is, it had a version of Take 5, which I didn't have the Dave Brubeck Take 5 version. I knew the track. I don't even know how I knew the track. Maybe it's just part of being my age or something. I certainly knew the track. It was a big hit single, but I was barely an infant. I might not even been born. I think, what was Take 5? 59 or so? It was the year I was born. but I knew Take 5. And so they do a Take 5 version here, which makes sense because Paul wrote it. And I believe I just read that all of the residual money, because Paul wasn't married and didn't have kids, of Take 5, I believe, goes to the Red Cross now. I believe he put that in his will. It was definitely, an organization like the Red Cross. And I want to say, I believe it was the Red Cross that's been getting all the money since he passed away in '77. Yeah, that's right. It goes to the Red Cross. I've got some factoids up here. And there's so many interesting facts and stories with Paul. I don't want to turn this into an hour-and-a-half video. I don't have the energy, but so there's a version of Take 5 on here. So that's another thing that sold me on it. But the interesting thing with it is the version of Take 5, there's no piano. It's very hard to picture, and I would be playing it in the background, but one of the reasons that the first time I recorded this video didn't make it was for copyright infringement stuff. So I'm just not going to take that chance. And so I would love to have Skylark playing in the background. I'd love to have the Don Elliott record playing in the background so people could get a sample of that. And I really hope you guys maybe, try to look for some of that stuff here on YouTube. Get a sample of it, because that Don Elliott thing is really interesting. It's really pretty. So here's a version of Take 5 with no piano. Well, I mean, the first thing you hear in Take 5 is piano. And I just couldn't picture it. So it's a quartet with Paul on alto sax, a guy named Jerry Fuller on drums, a guy named Don Thompson on acoustic bass, and a guy who was new to me, Ed Bickert, a Canadian guitarist on electric guitar. So it's up to Ed Bickert, this was the first time I heard any of the members of this band, actually. It's up to Ed Bickert to kind of recreate the piano part of Take 5. And I'm like, I don't know how you would do that. And he does it by picking the notes. When you hear him play it, it makes sense. But if I hadn't heard a guitarist do it first and somebody told me I have to play that on guitar, I don't think I would have figured out how. It would have just been a mess. So Ed Bickert does an incredible job by finger picking, essentially, or plucking the individual notes in a pianistic fashion, and a fantastic version of Take 5. And a great band, and the recording sounds really good for a club record. I'm sure it was a crappy little club that they were playing in Canada. And I got turned on to the talents of the entire band, especially impressed with Ed Bickert, the guitarist, because obviously he's going to get a lot of solo space when Paul Desmond isn't playing a melody or taking a solo himself. The guitar is the only other real lead instrument in there that's going to get solos. And, Ed Bickert, very much in the Jim Hall school. He was very well known for pretty much playing a Telecaster, a Fender Telecaster guitar, pretty much his whole jazz career. And it's not, I don't know any other jazz guitarist that played a Telecaster, not as their regular guitar, certainly. So he got known a bit for that. And a very mellow, pretty album. A little bit nice write-up on the guys, a little portrait to the guys. And if I can coordinate myself, see the notes, the actual sheet, the music sheet for Wendy, which was one of Paul's originals. There's a bunch of his originals on here. A Jobim tune, Antonio Carlos Jobim. A couple jazz standards. Here's That Rainy Day, which is a track I love. My Funny Valentine, Take 5, Things That Ain't What They Used to Be. Manha di Carnaval. So some really nice tracks. A lot of them that people would know from other versions. But, rearranged the Desmond way. Did I show the back cover? So, nice album. About 71 minutes or so. 2 tracks per side. And it did I didn't waste any time when it got reissued on CD. the nice thing was, because of the playing time, they could fit it all onto one CD without having to delete anything out. The amazing thing was that not only did they include the full 2-record set, but they actually added another track, something else that was another track called Line for Lions, Lyons, which was performed but wasn't on the original album. And it's a 7.5-minute track, and it brings the thing up to the longest possible running time you can have on the CD. It's over 79 minutes. So they got both of the discs, all the material from both of the discs, all 8 tracks, and a 9th track of something. It's not even an alternate take of one of the tracks they played. It's a whole nother track that they played that just never made it to the original album. Really makes the CD worthwhile. On A&M, I'm surprised. I'm surprised A&M even bothered to put this out. And to be honest, I bought this when it was first reissued, 2000. So I hope it's still in print. It's just another one of those, kind of unique groups. I know the Pure Desmond album that he put out, which I don't have. I have to get that. Was a fairly popular album by him. I'm not sure what the lineup was, but I do know that it used musicians that, kind of like a gathering of some of the people that I've shown you between the CTI release and this one. He was also working as a sideman, and one of the, this might even, this is one of the early albums I had where Paul played on at all. Recorded in April 1975, and I've shown this was Jim Hall's album, Concerto. And, this is a famous jazz album. I think if everybody doesn't have this and they like jazz, they should. Jim Hall on guitar, Don Sebesky, my favorite arranger, arranged the Concerto, which is a 19-minute version. Roland Hanna, piano, Ron Carter on bass, Steve Gadd on drums, Chet Baker, first place I ever heard Chet Baker, I'm pretty sure, on trumpet, and Paul Desmond on sax. This was done in 75, so Paul was doing sideman gigs as well at this time. And let me see. Paul also, in addition to doing sideman gigs, he had done that one that I just showed you, the Jim Hall album. Jim Hall played with Paul Desmond as part of his band. And when Paul was putting together a group to do, I don't think Paul had a real steady, ongoing band set up in his solo career. When he had gigs or a recording date, he would put a band together, and it wouldn't necessarily stay together, even though he did use some of the same instruments, same musicians, over the years. It was pretty much, I think, him calling up and saying, are you available for this or that date? He had played with Jim Hall a bunch, and Jim Hall knew Ed Bickert, the Canadian guitarist that plays on the live album that I just showed. And it was Jim Hall that actually recommended Ed Bickert to Paul Desmond. Paul Desmond did not know him. And it's strange, the two guitarists had a friendship. They knew each other. Jim Hall spoke very highly of Ed Bickert and his talents and abilities as a guitarist. And I'm sure I have Ed Bickert solo somewhere, and I haven't been able to find it. Canadian guitarist that worked up until the 2000s, and he retired when his wife passed away. Now, he's in his mid to late 70s now anyway. But Ed Bickert is a Canadian guitarist that stayed in Canada for most of his career. So, and I remember seeing him on television, on PBS. There was, I don't even know if it was PBS now. I had a guess. I can't imagine where else it would be. There was a show a number of years ago, about 10 or 15 years ago, that showed mainly older clips. It was like a compilation show. And it was, I think, only a half hour. And they, instead of playing older jazz concerts, which I wish they would have done, that looked like they were recorded on videotape, they would take one track off of this concert, recorded live in a club on videotape, put that up there, and take another track from another band recorded at a different club at a different time. So I kind of did a compilation show. And I remember on one of these compilation shows that I saw several tracks by Ed Bickert playing in that was a trio quartet. I want to say it was probably just a trio. And, with this Telecaster. And a very impressive guitarist. So I can see why Jim Hall recommended him, and very much in the Jim Hall school. And that Paul Desmond album, if you want a double dose and you want to hear Paul Desmond and Ed Bickert together, and I'm not sure who plays on Pure Desmond. I should have looked it up. It may be Jim Hall. It may even be Ed Bickert. I know Paul Desmond, in the end, ended up thinking quite highly of Ed Bickert after getting him as a recommendation from Jim Hall, and did use him in the future. And Ed won a bunch of awards. I think it's Canada that has the Juno Awards for Best Album, Best Jazz Album. And Ed Bickert and Don Thompson, who is the Canadian bassist who plays on the live album with Paul Desmond, the two of them worked together. Ed Bickert and Don Thompson worked together and won a Best Jazz Album Award in Canada on a couple different occasions, actually. So he was fairly well known within the jazz community, certainly. Let's see. Yes, Ed Bickert and Don Thompson won the Juno Award in 1980 for Best Jazz Album. Bickert had a duet with another guitarist, Lauren Lofsky. They won another Juno Award album for an album called This Is New. And in 1996, he was made a member of the Order of Canada, which Don Thompson also was made a member of the Order of Canada. So it's quite a I guess that's a big deal in Canada. Let me see. So Don Thompson, Canadian bassist, piano player, drummer. What the hell is vibraphone player? And Ed Bickert, Canadian guitarist. They're both still alive. I was introduced to them through Paul Desmond. So it kind of goes to show you how you link musicians together and how you get into one from the other. So anyway, getting back briefly to Paul Desmond, he recorded a couple albums with Chet Baker in '77. At this point, he was already diagnosed with lung cancer. If you go on Wikipedia, there's some really funny stories about, apparently Paul Desmond had quite a sense of humor, but there's also some funny stories about his relationship with Dave Brubeck because they were very much opposites. And at one point, I'd say they had very early in their career, after working together in the early days, they had a bit of a falling out because Dave Brubeck was a fairly conservative guy, and Paul Desmond was kind of a gambler and a bit of a drinker and a heavy smoker. And so he certainly had his habits that were very much kind of at odds with Dave Brubeck. And at one point, they played together early in their career, but they had split up. Paul Desmond decided he wanted to get back with Dave Brubeck, which ended up in creating the classic quartet. And Dave didn't want anything to have to do with him at all at that point. And Paul Desmond went to his house, and his wife had been under orders, apparently, Dave Brubeck's wife, not to let Paul Desmond in the house. But Dave Brubeck was out in the backyard. And if you can imagine hanging babies' diapers on a line outside to dry after being washed. And Paul Desmond decided he wanted to play once again and be in Dave Brubeck's group. And he knocked on the door, and Dave's wife let him in, despite Dave's orders not to, and proceeded to the backyard where Dave was hanging the diapers out to dry in the backyard, and spent quite a lot of time trying to convince Dave to let him back in the band. Losing my voice here. And apparently Dave did not want to let him into the band, and finally changed his mind when Paul Desmond promised to do babysitting for him. So that's a pretty funny story. As a result, Paul Desmond ended up getting quite close to Dave's kids, who are now playing in groups of their own. To the extent that one of them even thought he was an uncle, though Paul Desmond was his uncle for a long time. So Paul Desmond never actually got married. Said he had no shortage of girlfriends, but they kind of came and went. And because of his, rather poor habits, I guess whiskey drinker, that kind of thing, smoker, which was, you kind of expect that from a jazz musician, don't you? But unfortunately, some get affected by it, in negative ways, as he did. And when he got diagnosed with lung cancer, he kept working right until the end. But strangely enough, was only 52. So he was 52 when he passed away in May 1977, which is actually exactly 1 month before I graduated high school. He passed away, and the last, according to a discography, the last things that he played on were not his own solo albums. And it looks like actually the last solo album of his that came out, and it may have been the last one that was actually recorded, was the live album I showed. This may have been the last thing that he recorded as a leader anyway. Kind of sad. But it wasn't his last sessions. He did do a 25th anniversary reunion in 1976 with Dave Brubeck, and he recorded in 1977 as a sideman on 3 albums. And I've shown this before. He did 2 Chet Baker albums, and I want to say they were probably one big long session. And with his tracks spread out over 2. This was a Chet Baker thing. It wasn't a small group. It was there was some, I believe, Don Sebesky arrangements. There was some fairly large scale things. These were 2 separate albums that got released together. This package has them released together, and if you can get this package, it's called You Can't Go Home Again. But if you're going to try to pick it up, make sure you get the 2 CD version, which is out of print. Because it has all of the tracks. It's kind of confusing. Chet Baker came out with 2 albums, both of which Paul Desmond played on. One was called You Can't Go Home Again, which was the name of this. And the second one was called The Best Thing For You. And both of those are actually on this set. But I see now that what they did is they reissued each one separately. But they were recorded in the same batch of sessions with a varying array of different musicians. Some of the material was kind of arranged outside, and there's some strings, and Don Sebesky did some arranging on here, and there was actually even some of the things on this double album set has all the material from the 2 albums, You Can't Go Home Again and The Best Thing For You, but also a whole bunch of additional tracks. For some reason, they didn't tag on those additional tracks when they reissued the 2 albums separately after this went out of print, which was a shame, because there's some really dynamic stuff, some very interesting arrangements, and it didn't, that stuff that didn't get released till here actually had some overdubs that were done shortly before this was released in 2000. So some of the material was in the can and not issued on other albums that were extras on here, because they fill this thing to capacity pretty much with extra tracks. sad to see that they didn't take those extra tracks when they reissued the two albums separately again since then. No extra material. Really sad, because there's some incredible stuff that are the extras on here. A lot of it alternate takes, but there's a few tracks that were unique to this issue of the album that I highly recommend. And this is the most, it's a Chet Baker thing, I know, but Paul Desmond did play in a bunch of tracks. He plays well, and it's much more modern and almost fusiony. I mean, you have to know Chet Baker's kind of conservative bent. Probably the closest thing to fusion that Chet Baker ever did. You got the Don Sebesky thing. It's kind of like a CTI album in parts, but in a good way. It actually works. To me, a lot of the CTI stuff from the 70s sounds really dated in not a good way. A lot of music sounds dated, but it's okay. A lot of music from the 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever. But to me, a lot of the CTI stuff is not necessarily dated well. Even some of the stuff I like. Just something about it. But this is kind of like a really good CTI thing that where they tried to make maybe a more modern, slightly more electric sound, but it worked. And there's plenty of traditional jazz dudes on here doing their acoustic thing as well. But those sessions were really the last jazz sessions that Paul Desmond did, and the tracks were scattered over 2 different albums. And at that point, I believe Paul Desmond recorded this a matter of weeks before he passed away. So he already knew he had lung cancer. He was having trouble breathing, and yet when you listen to the tracks, you would never know that. Oddly, and I didn't know this until recently, the very last thing he recorded, and I'm sure it was a very, very small part, was the very last thing he recorded in 1977 was on an Art Garfunkel solo album called Watermark. I have not heard that album. Art Garfunkel, the singer, the vocalist from Simon and Garfunkel, formerly with Paul Simon, who I don't think he even records solo albums anymore. Kind of ballady singer. I don't think there would have been a great deal of space for a saxophone solo, but apparently somebody got the idea to call Paul Desmond, and oddly enough, that thing he did with Art Garfunkel was the very last thing he did in his life, which was a little strange. I always want to hear the album to hear his contribution to it, which was done apparently pretty much at the same time that he recorded these Chet Baker sides. So 52 years old. Too bad. I think he probably could have gotten away with the drinking, but not the smoking. Apparently did him in. At 52, though, wow. I didn't even realize until I really started doing some research. But he was a big doer Scotch whiskey and Pall Mall cigarettes, which I don't think they're around anymore. And a clarinetist that he worked with recalls in his clarinetist Perry Robinson, somebody I have on an album somewhere, I know, recalls in his autobiography that Desmond would sometimes need vitamin B12 shot just to go on playing during his later career. Sad. And he also had a nickname that I didn't know of until I was doing some research. He had a nickname he was of the Stork. And that's because he would sometimes, in his younger years, when he was in better health, play while standing on one leg, and he would kind of lean against the big acoustic piano that was on stage. And I guess he kind of looked like a stork when he did it. And I think that may have been during the Dave Brubeck years. So I'm not sure if it was Brubeck that gave him that nickname, but so lest anyone out there think Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull is the first musician to stand on one leg while playing a wind instrument. Apparently Paul Desmond beat him to it. Okay, so I've been going on for a long time. And I did want to make mention of my whole idea of this series, why I linked Dave Brubeck with Paul Desmond was, how you listen to one musician and it gets you into another musician. And I had mentioned that the fantastic sidemen that Paul Desmond used on his solo albums, which are my introduction to the Canadian jazz guitarist Ed Bickert, which I don't have anything here by Ed to show. I'm sure I bought a solo thing by him and I can't find it now. But if you like Jim Hall and can't get enough Jim Hall, I recommend Ed Bickert. If you can. Ed Bickert doesn't have a ton of solo albums done as a leader, but he's got a handful. I don't know about their in-print status, but then again, in the VC, it doesn't matter so much whether something's in print, because a lot of people, even if a CD is in print, they try to get the vinyl anyway. So he definitely has things as a leader. But if you really want to hear Ed Bickert, you can't find anything as a leader, that Paul Desmond, there's a lot of space on here, and you get to hear Ed Bickert and Don Thompson and Paul Desmond. So there's a lot of Ed Bickert space on there. Like I said, that was also my introduction to Don Thompson. And just to show how all these guys are almost in the same interconnected universe, I'd mentioned that how Paul Desmond really came to use Ed Bickert on guitar was through the recommendation of Jim Hall. Don't know exactly how Jim Hall first met Ed Bickert, but Don Thompson, the bassist, and Ed Bickert were very close musicians, friends who apparently played together. And Don Thompson is nonetheless a bass player, played off and on with Jim Hall. So I know I'd read that he played in 1974 with Jim Hall, Don Thompson. This particular album was from 1981, played in a trio. This is a good album, too, Circles, if you're a Jim Hall fan. This is one you should have. This is from 81. And just a trio with Terry Clark on drums, Jim Hall on guitar. Don Thompson plays piano and bass. I think he just plays piano on one track. But I think this, I didn't even realize it was the same, Don Thompson was the same guy that was playing on the Paul Desmond album for years. Thought he was just a member of Jim Hall's trio. This is a good album too. They even do an original. The title track, Circles, is actually a Don Thompson original. So Jim Hall obviously thought fairly highly of Don Thompson's abilities. So I knew who Don Thompson was through the Jim Hall thing, through the Paul Desmond thing where I first heard him. And then I remember, I can remember the store, the Disco Mat store where I bought this. Don Thompson did do albums. He did some albums, like I mentioned, with Ed Bickert, the guitarist, but he did others as a leader. And this is one of them, Don Thompson. It's called the Don Thompson Quartet, though there's a bunch of tracks on here that are basically a trio. But being an ECM fan and seeing John Abercrombie and Dave Holland, and I already knew who Don Thompson was. I'm like, how can I not buy this? And Michael Smith is the drummer. This is an album that the reason that there's, I don't know how many vinyl used copies there are of this around, but unfortunately, in a matter of bad timing, this came out just a couple years before the CD era. So it did not, and still has not, got released on CD. This was recorded in January 1984, probably released later in 84. So missed the CD era by about 2 years. Too bad. It's Concord Jazz, and Concord was a good label for a long time, but and they're still around, but they totally, it seems like they don't care anymore about their back catalog, and maybe it's just they can justify it. They can say it's not selling, so we don't make it available. But the amount of stuff that Concord has allowed to go out of print from the LA4 albums to Herb Ellis albums, Charlie Bird albums, tons of other people that I love, guitarists especially. I'm just really sad. And they have one Herb Ellis in Montreux, which was an album that was a good, live album that was really good, that came out in the early 80s, never got released on CD. And a few things Charlie Bird, LA4 did get released on CD, and they allowed them to go out of print. I'm just really bummed out by that. This one never apparently got to see it, in print. And What it is Don Thompson plays piano and bass on here. On the tracks he plays piano, Dave Holland plays bass. So Dave Holland lays out on about 3 out of the 8 tracks. Don Thompson plays piano on 3 tracks. No, actually, yeah. Don Thompson plays piano on 3 tracks on this album. Dave Holland plays bass on those 3 tracks. Don Thompson plays bass on 5 tracks, the other 5 tracks of the album. And Dave Holland does play bass on one of those tracks. So one of those tracks actually has 2 upright bass players on it. Very interesting to hear. But it's only for 1 track. And Dave Holland lays out of the other 4 tracks on the album. So it's got Don Thompson on piano and bass. John Abercrombie plays just electric guitar throughout the album. Dave Holland on 4 tracks. And Michael Smith plays drums on all tracks. It's a nice album. It's an interesting album. It's got a couple standards. My One and Only Love, a track called I've Never Been in Love Before, which is a Frank Lesser track. The title track, Beautiful Friendship, is apparently Stanley Stein and Donald Kahn track. And apart from that, there's 3 Don Thompson originals, which are really nice tracks. There's, interestingly, a John Abercrombie. The album starts off with a John Abercrombie original called Even Steven, which is almost a little bit Pat Metheny-ish. Don Thompson plays piano on that track, and it's not a track that I've ever heard. I don't think John Abercrombie recorded it anywhere else on any of his other solo albums. I don't think he recorded it as a sideman anywhere else either. So it seemed to be a track he may have put together for this album. And nice little track. And there's one track by Paul Chambers, the great bass player, played for Miles Davis for many years and also played with Wes Montgomery. Paul Chambers had a small handful of solo albums done under his own leadership. And that would probably be the only place where you could hear a Paul Chambers original, because Miles didn't record them, and they didn't record them with Wes Montgomery. But there's a track called Ease It, written by Paul Chambers. And it's probably a very rare instance where a Paul Chambers original got recorded by anybody else besides Paul Chambers. So Don Thompson paying homage, I guess, to Paul Chambers, and an original track that Don Thompson wrote for Scott LaFaro, famous bass player with the Bill Evans Trio. I believe that's the one track that has both Don Thompson on bass and Dave Holland on bass. It's the For Scott LaFaro. Nice album, bad timing because, as soon as CDs came out, a lot of places around here anyway ditched the whole vinyl thing immediately. And you couldn't get this after a couple of years. So I actually recently played the vinyl of this and made a digital copy for myself before the vinyl degrades any further. Nice album. Did I show the picture of Don Thompson there? Don Thompson is, an outgrowth of Paul Desmond, just like Ed Bickert was. I'd probably, if it wasn't for Paul Desmond, not know who Don Thompson was. Which means I would not have Don Thompson records like I do. And I think am I missing something? I just wanted to point, there's one other CD album that I have by Don Thompson. Funny thing is the record cover caught my attention before I realized it was even a Don Thompson album. And I'm trying to maybe I'll take this out of the case here. Maybe that'll help a little bit. Another thing called Don Thompson Quartet called Winter Mist. Fantastic, beautiful photograph, which caught my eye before I even read who it was. And Don Thompson, who I mentioned, besides, I guess he's probably best known as a bass player, but he also plays piano. He also plays drums. I don't think I have any albums of his where he actually plays drums, even his solo stuff. And also vibraphone. Now, in this particular album, which is this is a lovely, I gotta highly recommend this. I actually even like this better than the one I showed with John Abercrombie on it, just because I don't know, it just works, Not that the other one doesn't, but I really love this album. The music on here, it's mellow, it's conservative jazz, but it's really just daydreamy, pretty stuff. I'm not familiar with the band, but I like the instrumentation. A guy named Barry Elms on drums, a guy named Pat Collins on bass, who plays upright bass, Reg Schwager on guitar, electric guitar, very clean electric guitar, very much in the jazz tradition. And Don Thompson plays only vibes on this album, just vibraphone. And this is a live club date, recorded in a club in Toronto, Canada, which is Don Thompson, as well as actually Ed Bickert's pretty much home base, I guess, over 2 nights in April in 1990. This is recorded live to 2-track. So, not a lot of information in there, but that's a lot. It's a really, 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 really pretty album. And I know it's out of print, but I know that and I think it only came out on CD. And it's fairly long. I want to say it's, I added up at one point. I want to say it's about 70 minutes maybe. But it's got a bunch of originals. It's got an original written by the drummer, fairly unusual. It's got a couple standards, like Alone Together. It's got an original by the guitarist. A couple original by the guitarists, actually. Blue Monk by Thelonious Monk. And, of course, it's got some Don Thompson originals on there. 9 tracks on there. It's the Jazz Alliance Incorporated is the record label in Concord, California. So oddly enough, it's not a Canadian label. It's a California label, even though everybody in it's Canadian. It was recorded in Canada. I highly recommend this. I know this is out of print. It doesn't normally stop members of the VC. Actually, it encourages them more. Now, Don Thompson, he did a whole lot. He backed a whole lot of musicians. I would say I missed a lot of history with Ed Bickert, the Canadian guitarist, because he backed up Rosemary Clooney, in addition to having his own solo albums, and Don Thompson, his compatriot, I guess, his buddy, his comrade in arms in Toronto, Canada, did a whole bunch of stuff. Don Thompson was a member of the John Handy Quintet in the mid '60s, which he recorded albums for. He worked with Frank Rosolino. I guess mostly he was known as a West Coast jazz musician. Maynard Ferguson, Denny Zeitlin, even George Duke. So Don Thompson was working a bunch in the United States during a specific period, I guess, in the mid '60s, before he went back to Canada in the late '60s, and pretty much stuck his butt in Toronto in about '69 and stayed there. He was a member of Rob McConnell's Boss Brass Band, as was, I believe, Ed Bickert, the guitarist, was a member of Rob McConnell's band as well. Interesting thing, though, is Don Thompson was actually the percussionist in Rob McConnell's Boss Brass Band, and during his membership in the band in the early '70s, he switched to bass, and many years later, he actually became piano player in the group. So he's been all over the place, and like I said, also plays vibraphones. I love the way he plays vibraphone. So he also worked with guitarist Lenny Bro or Bray, depending on American guitarist, the late guitarist. So he's worked around quite a lot with a lot of people, and he was actually part of the house rhythm section in the Bourbon Street Jazz Club, which was where the Paul Desmond album was recorded, and was kind of the bass player if a visiting, especially from the U.S., jazz musician was coming to play in Toronto, didn't have a backing band, he would be the bassist for the Toronto's Bourbon Street Jazz Club. So he got to play with a bunch of people in there. Jim Hall, which you saw the album that he recorded with Jim Hall and others as well. Milt Jackson, Art Farmer, Clark Terry. So he played with quite a lot of people. And actually, even though he is currently 75 years old, um, he still works as a freelance musician, Don Thompson. And he's, like I said, he's won a couple awards, Juno Awards for Best Jazz Album. He got a bunch of awards in the starting in the early mid 80s, all through the 90s into the early 2000s for these are Canadian Jazz Awards for Vibraphonist of the Year, Composer of the Year, but he's got more. He's got a bunch for. How many times was he named in the Jazz Report, which I guess is like a Canadian jazz journal or jazz magazine? He got named the Vibraphonist of the Year like 6 times, 5 or 6 times. In addition to the Juno Awards, and he got a Jazz Report also awarded him Composer of the Year in '94. So he's quite well known in Canadian jazz. He might be one of the bigger people. Even played with Mel Torme, Rob McConnell, Boss Brass, Emily Remler, Dave Liebman. He's quite well. He's one of those guys. I think he's probably more well known with jazz musicians than he is with the listening public. Born in 1940. So I just wanted to. I didn't want to talk this long. Show how Paul Desmond led into a whole different generation of guys for me, and oddly enough, Canadian jazz musicians getting into Don Thompson and Ed Bickert, people like that, and how Dave Brubeck all fed into all this, and even Cal, Cal Jader, which is somebody I'll do I'm threatening to do a video on as well. Was another early associate of Dave Brubeck. Though I think I might have, in Cal Jader's case, I might have discovered him just on my own by variously thumbing through the racks as I used to do, and it looked interesting, and I love the vibraphone. So I think I found out about the Brubeck connection maybe later. So okay, guys, I didn't mean to do a marathon. I did a marathon as the first one for a long time. Sorry about that. I just wanted to make mention of one thing, that the poster in the background. I've been having an ongoing conversation with Jeff, Vinyl Spin Jeff. And one of the things we found that we had in common was an apparent interest and love for the imagery, at very least, of Easter Island. And I mentioned to him how I bought this poster, which you can see in the back there. It took me about 2 hours to get that to stand like that. I bought that poster over a year ago, and it was supposed to go right here on this wall right here, which is eventually where it will end up. But number one, it's a hell of a lot bigger than it looks even back there. And it's a hell of a lot heavier. It's on very thick paper. And I can't hang it by myself, and I need somebody else to. Anybody in the VC wants to come to northern New Jersey and help me hang that damn thing, I can tell you that is going to be a job. You probably need 3 people. It's heavy. You have to put mounts on the friggin' wall. I had no idea it would be such a job, so I've had that thing hanging out here for over a year now, rolled up. And I've been talking to Jeff about how we have some things in common, a love of pop art, especially from the 1950s and 60s, and from like the drive-in animation art from the in between the movies that you used to see and all that kind of thing, and eventually got to Easter Island somehow. How I love the photographs and imagery, and I spent a pretty penny on that friggin' poster, and I was obviously had a job at the time that I bought that. And I've been wanting to somehow get that on camera to show to Jeff. So I just finally did that today. Okay, guys, so that's a long-winded one. I'll do Cal Jader at some point. When I come back and do other videos, I'm going to do probably a bunch of short ones, just oddities that I have, not necessarily rare things that nobody has, but kind of swimming through my stuff, my archives here. I have a couple quirky things that I wanted to show people, not because they're rare, but just because they're unusual and not probably really desirable in a big way to a lot of people. Also, you're going to see things that you're probably not in. Probably the people in the VC aren't going to be too interested in, because we're getting to that time of year. I'm a big Halloween nut, so I'm going to be posting a couple things on here. I'll say not necessarily videos, but my channel will be putting up some things that are more Halloween themed that really have not a lot to do with the VC. So when you see those, don't think that I'm giving up on the VC, but I'm going to be putting up some Halloween things. I just got to get permission for a couple of them. On my old channel, I had created a couple. I just basically copied the audio of a CD of some ghost stories and things like that. And I'd gotten permission to put them up from the guy that created them. And I want to put them on this channel. So I am going to be putting things up that maybe guys from the VC won't be interested in. But I'm not giving up on the VC. It's just going to be until Halloween's over. They're going to be interspersed with music stuff. So hopefully, they'll you'll be able to tell that from the music stuff. And I'm going to be doing some chit chat about some CDs, but not necessarily music CDs and things like that. Okay. So hopefully you've enjoyed the stuff I've been putting up in lieu of me coming on and talking. The old jam session from 1994 with my buddy Glenn being one of them, got CD that I just found, dug up in one of my piles. And I thought, I really didn't think much of it at the time. It's been years since I listened to it. When I listened back to it, I'm like, well, considering it's live, I couldn't remix it. There was no way to mix it. I couldn't fix the bum notes and all that. It wasn't too bad. So I thought, I was not costing anybody anything to listen to it. So I thought I'd put it up. So hopefully, you guys found some of that enjoyable. And I'll be back probably soon with some shorter stuff, okay? So thanks for putting up with me for this long one once again, which I apologize for. I'll be back soon, and I hope everybody's doing well. Take care.